is Professor Patricia Williams. Patricia is a professor of law at Columbia University and writes a column for The Nation magazine titled Diary of a Mad Law Professor. Professor Williams is a member of the board of directors of the Council for Responsible Genetics and has served on the advisory council for the Medgar Evers Center for Law and Social Justice of the City University of New York and on the board of governors for the Society of American Law Teachers, among others. She was also the recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Her publications include The Alchemy of Race and Rights, The Rooster's Egg, Seeing a Colorblind Future, The Paradox of Race, and most recently, Open House on Family, Food, Friends, Piano Lessons, and the Search for a Room of My Own. Professor Williams.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a tremendous privilege to be here and to speak to this audience. And let me just start by saying that I am certainly not an expert in genetics. I am a lawyer by training and by profession, and one of the things that I am particularly concerned about as a lawyer is the way in which the history of race insinuates itself into conversations of biology. The piece that I wrote for Gene Watch was called The Elusive Variability of Race. By elusive variability, I could have as easily said the inconsistencies, the incoherence, and the outright stupidity, but I thought I would go for dignity. Now, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time trying to prove that race is not biological. I do get the sense that we all accept that in this room. But what I am really interested in is what is race, if not biology? And how is it that, given a world of free choice that Bob Pollack, for example, described, we so consistently fall back on it, and where it's, how deeply it's inscribed? What are those? How do we maintain the sort of cognitive dissonances of what we mean by race? And so when I think of what Bob drew as the little orbit of the me, and then the stuff I like, and then the stuff I hate, I think that one of the other part of who we are as I think Bob was referring to us as individual organisms, but I think in a sociological or anthropological sense, that's also the model for Homo economicus. And there's a way in which we are, in fact, in the social setting, not discrete individuals, although we like to fancy ourselves as that. We're also situated social creatures, who perhaps to some biological extent, but that's not what I'm hypothesizing, perhaps to some biological extent, we also love to sort of curl up in the cave and pick nits out of each other's hairs. But there is this way in which we are dependent upon each other, and that's really the social construct I want to deal with. So in my little solar system, that me would be plural. So it would be we, it would be our stuff, and then stuff I hate, stuff we hate. And that sense of wanting to be within a group, takes many forms, obviously. We are New Yorkers. That's one identity grouping. We are of a particular religion. That's another. But race is a proxy, perhaps. And I think that's the insidious part of it. There's something romantic about race. There's something collective and warm and fuzzy, as comforting as having one's back scratched. And leaving that circle, leaving that identity grouping, I think is part of the difficulty of really thinking beyond not just the self, but thinking of where one's individuality is situated as a member of society. And so, in that sense, race is a kind of hierarchical social construct that assigns human value and group power. And so social constructions are, of course, human inventions and the products of mind and of circumstance. And this, again, is not to say that they are solely imaginary in the sense of fiction. They have real consequences in the real world, but they are the products of our imagination, of our intellect. And they affect the material conditions of survival. They allot relative respect and privilege, education, wealth or poverty, medical and dental care, birth control, housing options, degree of status. All of this is assigned by, or is affected or implicated by race. And I think one of the things that we don't always take into account is the enormous variability, and that's really the subject of my paper, of how we have constructed race, even in this country, where we today, I think, conceptualize it as only black as opposed to white. In antebellum America, for example, race was determined by a number of variables, depending upon the state. In some states, it was color. In some states, it was ancestry, like who your parents were, ethnicity, association in some places. Simply if you hung out, if you slept with an Indian or a black person or an Irish person who were considered a separate race, that affected your status. By your behavior, if you acted in a certain way, if you acted something other than an honorable Southern gentleman, you were lowered in status, and you became sort of a buffer group, like poor white, had racial implications, not simply class implications as well. If you certain property records. If you couldn't prove that you weren't part of somebody's estate, Litigating Whiteness is a wonderful book by Ariella Gross that I recommend highly, of people who couldn't prove blood and couldn't overcome the presumptions buried in property records. And so during Jim Crow, appearance became foregrounded as singularly important, and then you had increased importance of rules like the so-called one-drop rule. And we think today as the one-drop rule is the exclusive determinant of race in this country. It never was until the extreme importance placed upon it, upon color, upon physiognomy, upon that aspect of phenotype during Jim Crow. Religion is also a big part of the affirmation, so to speak, of the insidious romantic power of race. So when one of the earlier speakers spoke of polygynists and that theory advanced by Samuel Morton, I want to underscore the degree to which this was not simply a scientific theory. It comes from the term polygenesis, and genesis was a religious theory as well, that in certain, what lingers today as Christian identity movements, that God made several attempts at making man. And the first attempt, he sort of burned one model in the oven, which is when black people were created. And then he tried again for a more perfect version of humanity. And that has been a very, very powerful part of the evangelical movement. What actually distinguishes many branches of the evangelical movement in this country from, for example, British evangelicals. A lot of that power, like Bob Jones University, for example, really arose during the Jim Crow era, in certain parts of the South. And so until very recently, Bob Jones actually had on its, and I'm talking about like 2000, when President Bush went to Bob Jones University. It was only then that they took down, for those very specific political reasons, their statement that, their belief is that God created the tribes, which in 1999 had actually been the races, but at any rate, separately and at separate moments. So this is very, very much part of our imagination, of our cultural imagination, about who we are, where we begin and end in terms of the groupings, the clans, the packs that make us up. Now, I'm also interested that when Skip Yates was arrested, in addition to, I'm glad you answered that, Shelley, about whether or not they actually took a swab from him, or whether or not they only had to go back to whatever databases he had already set up with himself in it, was his proclamation at one point that that he had married a white woman and his children were half white. And I'm really intrigued by these descriptions that are also populate our cultural imagination, even by people who know the science of this, who use words like biracial, which implies, bi as a root of two, as though one half of this and one half of that. So in some weird way, we're bringing back sort of Louisiana codes of 1/72 this or 1/50, and instead we're reinscribing a kind of octoroon, quadroon, mulatto system. And reinscribing that vocabulary in a vocabulary upon a scientific database that is extraordinarily flawed. And I refer you to, of course, Duana Fulwiley's work, which deconstructs this absolutely excellently and in more detail than I have time to go into at this point. So Even in teaching the small courses I teach, the small seminars, to my very well-educated Columbia law students, inevitably, having accepted that we are all one species, the inevitable question I get is, well, what about subspecies? After all, and I quote one student, blacks, Jews, Asians, you can't deny they're different. It's like a poodle or a dachshund or a Saint Bernard is to the species of dog. Now, this sort of perception is not a matter that will be resolved, I think, by yet more scientific testing. Rather, I think this reiterated resistance to data is testament to the persistence, again, of this kind of cultural imagination, to which we're all subject based on, again, a kind of romantic need for collectivity. And that we still wonder if there aren't significant disparities in human intelligence that might be logically tracked through the randomness that is race is, again, testament to the power of belief over documentary evidence. And this infernal miasma invites a bit of consideration about the Manichaean constructs of determinism and free will, mind and body, choice and constraint, illogic and sheer destiny. But what is it, in other words, about race that makes it both so dangerously essentialized as well as so fleetingly, maddeningly beyond definitional containment? So let me begin with my favorite story, which is some years ago. It's actually some years ago. The science has certainly changed since then. But if you recall, or you may recall, that there were a lot of articles about DNA and ancestry tracking. It was sort of at the beginning of this. And Mark Shriver, who was at that time heading up the now defunct DNA print genomics company, had just started it. The newspaper covered it in an article called DNA Tells Students They Aren't Who They Thought They Were. And Shriver was described as routinely administering DNA tests to its students and then having them analyzed for what the article called genetic ancestry. And the test at that time compared DNA with that of 4 parent populations: Western European, West African, East Asian, and Indigenous American. And the first indication that this was a more romantic than wholly rational enterprise was the classification, of course, of these as parent populations. The 4 categories are and were enormously overly broad for purposes of meaningful ancestry tracking and unduly randomly narrow in terms of geographic diversity. And given the actual diversity of present-day American populations, the only logic behind this choice of the 4 groups is that it roughly segregates according to older anthropological descriptions of race as color, that is to say, white, black, yellow, and red. And indeed, that's exactly what the students in Shriver's class did with the results of this test. The article then reduced it even more and went on for 2 full columns, or 3 full columns, discussing the degree to which the Penn State students were revealed to be either only black or white. And I quote, "About half of the 100 students tested this semester were white, according to an instructor, and every last one of them said, 'Oh man, I hope I'm part black, because it would upset their parents.' People want to identify," this is the instructor speaking, "people want to identify with this pop multiracial culture. They don't want to live next to it, but they want to be part of it. It's cool." Close quote. But the test, again, purported to show, albeit flawed, geographic origins, and it's interesting to see how quickly those geographic origins of European, African, and Asian, and Native American was conflated instantly with no pause or hesitation into the matter of color, and from there into the politics of exoticized inclusion against a backdrop of ritual exclusion. So there is this remarkable persistence in reinscribing race onto the narrative of biological inheritance. And again, this science is always pursued only for the noblest of reasons. In Shriver's class's case, for example, it was for the potential importance of racial or ethnic background to drug trials. And again, I'll say for another time my concern about the feckless commercial competition for race-specific medicines, and suggest only that a more coherent enterprise might center on individualized genomic medicine rather than on the ever-changing political variables of racialized bodies. For now, just consider the description of one student who in that test discovered, quote unquote, that she was 58% European and 42% African.